I'm speaking from Darwin country, and I'll begin by paying my respects to the elders, past and present, of the Aboriginal people of this part of the world, and also to those of the Aboriginal people wherever you may be, including the Bidjigal people, who own the land that UNSW is on. Welcome to everybody who's here tonight, whether they're either in Australia, in Timor-Leste. It's wonderful to have so many people from Timor-Leste here, from the United States and elsewhere. My name's David Dixon. I'm the chair of the Diplomacy Training Program, and it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's event. What we're going to do tonight is to talk about the historical record about what happened all those years ago. But it's not just about historical quibbling or setting historical facts right. It's about much more than that. What we're talking about tonight is about the obligations of friendship, about the responsibilities of one generation for the things that were done in its name by previous generations. And of course, there are many relevant aspects of those two obligations and responsibilities in the terms of the relationship between Australia and Timor-Leste. But it's the relevance goes much further. If you think also about our responsibilities and obligations to just two obvious examples: the people of Afghanistan, and to the Kurdish people of northern Iraq. In very many ways, the same issues of obligation and responsibility continue. So I'd like, on behalf of the Diplomacy Training Program, I'd like to welcome everyone and to hand over to the one person who, the old cliche about needing no introduction, Susan, whose work has got to be acknowledged. I think, people talk about Australians of the Year. I think Susan Connelly should be voted Australian of every year. So Susan, please.
Oh my goodness, thank you very much, David. And really it is wonderful to be here tonight with you all. As we hear of the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Darwin this weekend, let's also remember the people whose land was invaded during those fateful hours and who endured a 4-year occupation. We remember their assistance and friendship, and with so many other Australians, we want to say to the Timorese people with conviction and energy, your friends do not forget you. As David was talking, I'm conscious that there are people watching this from Japan, and I'm so very, very pleased about that. Welcome. I'm going to introduce all the speakers now, so you can, because I think it will make the whole thing smoother. So that's what we're going to do. And this is the order in which they will speak. Now, first of all, we have Professor Peter Stanley of the University of New South Wales, Canberra. Peter is one of Australia's most active military social historians, the author of over 40 books, most in the field of Australian military history. He was formerly the principal historian of the Australian War Memorial, where he worked from 1980 until 2007. Then we will hear from Dr. Kirsty, who was an activist, as we know, for the freedom of East Timor and was the First Lady of Timor-Leste from 2002 to 2007. Something very dear to my heart, having worked with the Mary MacKillop Institute of East Timorese Studies, she champions mother tongue education as the basis of all true literacy. Kirsty works for the social empowerment of Timorese people, especially women and children. And she is, as we know, the founding director of the renowned Alola Foundation. Then we'll hear from Paul Cleary. Paul was a journalist and he is an author of great note. He became an advisor to Timor-Leste on resource negotiations. He's written extensively on resource conflicts and policy, and also on the First Peoples of Australia. He also wrote that marvellous book, The Men Who Came Out of the Ground, a fascinating account of the World War II Timor campaign. Now, those three presenters will be presenting in that order, and their presentations will be live. Then, thanks to the wonderful Claire Sidoti and her team, we will move then to pre-recorded presentations. And the first one will be by Gregório Rosa. Now, Gregório is the son of Salustiano Rosa, one of the many Timorese who helped our men in 1942. As a little child, as you will hear, he was caught up in the mayhem, and his story is that of family experience. Then we will hear from Ana Maria Ferreira, who remembers the stories of the pressures on her family as they escaped from village to hiding in the mountains. Hers is a story of people being refugees in their own country, fearful of invaders, and then displaced, even after the war. We'll hear We'll hear from Edward Willis, the president of the Second Commando Association. The group is committed to preserving the memory of these exceptional commandos, including those on Timor in 1942. It is an avenue for the descendants of those men and others to celebrate their resilience and achievements. The association promotes Australian knowledge and admiration of the Timorese people. Can I ask, was I on mute then when I was giving all that introduction?
No.
No, good. After we've heard from Edward, we're going to hear from Michael Stone. Now, Michael is in Timor as we speak. He is leading a group commemorating the anniversary of the Japanese invasion, the sacrifice and solidarity of the Timorese people, and all who died and suffered in that campaign. Michael was in Interfet and became an advisor to the then president, Jose Ramos-Horta. Through Timor Awakening, he helps Australians to maintain an ongoing relationship and solidarity with the Timorese people. And lastly, we will hear from Dr. Jose Ramos-Horta, who has held the posts of President, Minister for Foreign Affairs, and Prime Minister in the first new nation of the 21st century, Timor-Leste. He received the 1996 Nobel Peace Prize, along with Bishop Carlos Bello, for working towards a just and peaceful solution to the conflict in East Timor. During the long Indonesian occupation, he strode the power hallways of the world's nations, arguing for freedom for the Timorese people. So these are our presenters this evening, and I'm very happy to hand over now to Professor Peter Stanley.
Great. Thank you very much, Susan, and good evening, friends and colleagues. I hope I had a title slide, but in order not to distract you, I'm going to turn off my video because I need to look away here. Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm very glad to be a part of such a warm and supportive network, even if temporarily. And can I also acknowledge the original custodians of the land on which I'm speaking, around Merimbula, New South Wales, the Yuin people. I want to start this talk by noting that in the coming week, we'll mark 2 anniversaries of events that occurred 80 years ago, as Susan said. Next Saturday, the 19th of February, will be the anniversary of Japan's bombing of Darwin. And the next day, the 20th of February, will be the 80th anniversary of the Japanese invasion of the island of Timor. Australians tend to remember the attack on Darwin, the first direct attack on Australian national territory, but they tend not to notice that the Japanese invaded Timor, or if they do, they focus on the heroic resistance of the Australian commandos there. You might say that Australia's long, complex and ambiguous relationship with the people of East Timor began exactly 80 years ago. Before then, Timor hardly figured in Australian history. And it's often rightly said that Australia owes the Timorese an obligation of blood because of Timorese support for the Australian commandos who resisted the Japanese invasion in a year-long campaign in 1942-43. Well, that's indeed so, and Australian troops who served in Timor as part of Sparrow Force forever after recalled with gratitude the Timorese who sustained them, which explains the presence this evening of Ed Willett and of Eva, whose father was a commando. But this evening, I want to ask, why were Australians fighting in Timor at all? The simple answer is because, of course, the Japanese invaded the island. The people of East Timor indeed became the victims of the aggressive attempt by Imperial Japan to create an Asian empire. They suffered severely. At least 40,000 Timorese civilians died during the Japanese invasion and occupation, and that's as many as Australia lost on all battlefronts in the entire war. The Timorese suffered like others under Japanese occupation from starvation and disease, from the destruction and theft of crops, from the impressment of labor, including women as sexual captives. The Japanese also fought a brutal counterinsurgency war in East Timor, one which brought reprisals and terror. But I think it would be too easy to simply blame the Japanese aggression for Timorese deaths. So let's ask again, why were the Japanese fighting in East, that is Portuguese Timor? And I think the more complex factual answer is that the Japanese were fighting Australians in East Timor because Australia had breached Portuguese neutrality. The Japanese invaded only because Australia had placed a military force in neutral territory. It's important, of course, to remember that the island of Timor was divided between the Dutch in the west and Portugal in the east. The Netherlands East Indies, with its rich reserves of oil, rubber, and rice, had always been part of Japan's expansionist vision, and it was swiftly occupied early in 1942. Timor, East Timor, Portuguese since the early 17th century, had not figured in Japan's war plans. Portugal, while favoring the Allies, remained neutral in this war. While the Japanese routinely flouted the laws of war and conducted brutal campaigns against civilian populations, they did not easily breach the neutrality of non-combatant nations. And remember, Portugal had two colonies in Asia, Macau and East Timor. Macau, though close to occupied Hong Kong and China, remained untouched. Timor became a battleground. Why? What made the difference? Well, as the likelihood of Japanese aggression increased in the early 1940s, Australia's planners, military planners, considered how they could best respond to war with Japan.
Hello.
Australia contributed a division. Sorry, I think you need to mute your mic there, whoever that was. Australia contributed a division, the 8th, to the defense of the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore, which of course fell 80 years ago today, or yesterday, and distributed a series of forces across what was optimistically called the Malay Barrier. And these small forces, all codenamed after birds, included Gull Force on Ambon, Lark on New Britain, Robin, New Caledonia, Heron, Ocean Island, and of course Sparrow Force in Dutch Timor. They were not expected to stop serious Japanese attacks. At best, they might have delayed the Japanese offensive. The bird forces, as they were called, were sent to Australian, British, Dutch, or French colonial possessions, territories ruled by nations at war with Japan. But Portugal was neutral in this war. A week after the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Portuguese dictator, Antonio Salazar, reluctantly agreed to allow Australian and Dutch troops of Sparrow Force to be stationed in Dili, but only, he said, if the Japanese were to actually attack. The troops landed anyway, 9 weeks before the Japanese actually attacked both Dutch and Portuguese Timor. It seems that the Japanese only invaded East Timor because it held an Allied garrison. If, as in Macau, the Allies had respected Portuguese neutrality, then the tragedy of the Japanese occupation could have been avoided. The Australian official history justified Australia's breach of neutrality by claiming that to imagine that the Japanese would respect it would have been an extravagantly optimistic view. But in fact, it was Australia and the colonial Dutch regime which contravened international law in this way. From 1942, February 1942, two Australian independent companies, Commandos, waged a skillful campaign in East Timor against an entire Japanese division until in early 1943, they were withdrawn. Australian survival depended crucially upon Timorese support, notably from criados, Timorese boys who acted as servants. The word, I understand, means servant in Tetum, and Australians describe themselves as the boys' masters. When they abandoned them in 1943, they left notes commending their criados as, and I quote, good bungs. The Japanese, ruthless in suppressing resistance, made Timorese civilians the target of their retribution, and the erosion of support impelled the Australian withdrawal. While 150 Australians died in the Timor campaign, as I said, 40,000 Timorese paid the real price. Has Australia made good the price in blood that they paid? Do we owe Timor a debt? And how have we repaid that debt? And what about Darwin, which is the occasion for our webinar? Well, the two Japanese raids on the 19th of February devastated the town, its port, and the airfield. But though destroying Darwin, the raids constructed several myths. First, that the raid was said to be as heavy as the raid on Pearl Harbor, which it wasn't. Second, that news of the raid was concealed. It was not. Third, that 1,000 people were killed, their bodies hastily disposed of in the mangrove swamps. They were not. About 240 died, the exact number uncertain because men died on small ships and their crews were undocumented. And of course, that hundreds of Australians died in the raids. But in fact, 3/4 of the dead were American sailors aboard the destroyer USS Cleary. And perhaps the most damaging of all, the raid's twisted history has created a myth that the attack heralded a Japanese invasion of Australia. In fact, while the Japanese High Command did consider invasion, it soon after decided against invading Australia. This has not stopped Australians from seeing the rest of 1942 and beyond as a battle for Australia, as if the campaigns in Papua, the Solomons, the Southwest Pacific, and indeed Timor were all about Australia. But among the invasions that really were launched in 1942, we must include Japanese aggression in East Portuguese Timor. In comprehending the immense suffering that unleashed on the island's people, we might reflect that it was decisions taken by the Australian government and its senior military commanders, which almost certainly precipitated the invasion. Australia does not just owe a debt to Timor-Leste because its people supported Australian troops and paid a horrific price, but also because war came to Timor after decisions made in Canberra, as well as in Tokyo. In this coming week, it's worth thinking of that. Thank you very much.
So we'll now hear from Kirsty Sword, please.
Thank you. Boa noite. Good evening, everyone. I pay my sincere respect to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose lands I'm speaking to you today. I'd also like to offer my deepest respect and gratitude to the tireless and fearless Susan Connelly for her steadfast and unwavering advocacy over many decades for the cause of justice and a life of dignity for the people of Timor-Leste. I feel very honoured to have been asked to share some reflections today on the World War II history that is shared by the people of Timor-Leste and Australia. It's a case of better late than never that 80 years on from the Japanese bombing of Darwin, attention is being drawn to the uncomfortable truth that it was Australia which violated the sovereignty of then Portuguese Timor and the neutrality of Portugal when it landed troops on Timorese soil on the 17th of December 1941, thus emboldening the Japanese military to do the same on the 19th of February 1942. As has already been mentioned, unthinkable horrors and the loss of between 40 and 60,000 Timorese lives ensued. When it comes to Timor-Leste, Australian public policy is renowned for being more than a little slow in aligning itself with both historical reality and the sentiments of the Australian public. Over the period of Indonesia's illegal occupation of Timor-Leste, while Australian veteran diggers from the 2nd and 4th Commando associations were lending their voices to the global solidarity movement for an act of self-determination for Timor-Leste, Australian diplomacy was busy covering up Indonesian atrocities and gross human rights violations in the territory, with a view to advancing the most favourable to Australia exploitation of oil and gas resources in the Timor Sea. Whilst a maritime boundary agreement was finally negotiated and signed in March 2018, the process highlighted Australia's bad faith in these negotiations through the revelation of the government's 2004 bugging of the Timor-Leste cabinet building. Two brave Australian men, Witness K and Bernard Cleary, continue to pay dearly for their courageous decision to call the Australian government out for its betrayal of our vulnerable and impoverished neighbour, Timor-Leste. But Australia's World War II history is also a tale of deep and abiding friendship, forged from the camaraderie, intense personal connections and shared hardship involving ordinary East Timorese men and women and the Australian soldiers who served in Timor between 1941 and 1943. It was the moving stories of friendship and solidarity of Australian diggers such as Paddy Connelly, Tom Nesbitt, Ralph Coyne and Norm Thornton, with their Timorese helpers, then known as criados, that inspired me to establish the Darwin Memorial Museum and Cafe in 2009. Michael Stone, with whom I'm proud to share this virtual stage today, and I worked with the local community of Fatunaba in Dare to create a space to honour and remember that friendship and Australia's ongoing debt of honour. The aim was to educate both international and East Timorese visitors about the facts and origins of that debt of honour and to celebrate the power of human solidarity and kindness, which transcends the self-serving and frankly racist narrative of historic Australian public policy in relation to Timor-Leste. Our Australian diggers carried the shame and guilt of having abandoned their brown-skinned friends when they evacuated to Australia in 1943. No such guilt seems to have plagued the leaders of successive Australian governments who unashamedly chose to sacrifice the Timorese for economic benefits for our already privileged and wealthy Australia. My work over 2 decades for women and children through my Alola Foundation has again and again highlighted the stark contrast in the conditions of life of ordinary East Timorese men and women and their Australian brothers and sisters across the Timor Sea. Here are just a few statistics. 12 times as many East Timorese children die in childbirth than here in Australia. If an East Timorese child survives childbirth, an event most commonly occurring in the home and with limited access to skilled medical personnel, close to 5% will die before reached 5 years of age, higher than that recorded in Australia. By the time an East Timorese child reaches school age, he or she will in all likelihood not have attended preschool or kindergarten, will face a 2-3 kilometre walk to and from school, be taught in a school without. That might be because only 50% of East Timorese have access to clean water, or that reliance on agriculture for subsistence means that hunger and malnutrition are still quite common at certain times of the year. It might also be due to the fact that a lack of education and access to basic services means that scores of East Timorese die each year of preventable diseases such as malaria, dengue, and gastrointestinal infections. Given that treatment for cancer, other than basic surgery, is unavailable inside the country, a cancer diagnosis is a death sentence for all but the wealthy able to seek medical care abroad. And I'm very happy to see my colleague from Alola's breast cancer program, Manakela, with us tonight. Boa noite, Manakela. All of these stark injustices are what motivate me and many thousands of Australians, including many of you online this evening, to grasp with both hands and diggers to continue to repay our debt of honour to the people of Timor-Leste. This webinar and its reframing of historical fact should spur us on further in our efforts to right the wrongs and injustices of the past, and to continue to stand firm alongside the courageous and resilient people of Timor-Leste, and to learn from the example of their bravery to forgive, to reconcile with the past, and to heal through truth-telling. Just think what important lessons the Timorese would have to share with Indigenous Australians, who are only now, after 2 centuries of dispossession and disadvantage, being granted platforms like the Yurok Justice Commission here in Victoria to tell their stories and to document their intergenerational trauma and its origins. Viva Timor-Leste. Thank you for listening to me today.
Viva.
Viva. Thank you very much, Kirsty. Thank you so much. And also thank you to Peter too. I forgot my job as moderator, I'm sorry. And I wish I had done the introductions differently. But however, they are done. And now I would like to call on Paul Cleary to talk with us. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Susan. And thanks to you so much for organising this. It's a real honour to speak here. Firstly, I also want to acknowledge the Camaragal people on whose land I live and work, and to acknowledge that sovereignty has not been ceded by the Camaragal people or any other Indigenous group in this country. And I think sovereignty is an important thing to think about in terms of this discussion we're having, and the point that Peter mentioned earlier about the neutrality of Portuguese Timor. I won't go over the comments made by Peter and Kirsty, except to say that I wholeheartedly agree with them. What I'll do is I might just talk a bit about my own research and my experience in interviewing many of the last surviving World War II veterans, both on the Timorese and Australian groups. I guess they were working together, obviously, but I travelled both to Timor and all around Australia. And I really want to make the point that the debt that we owe to the Timorese, I think, is immense. And I think the really important thing to think about here, and why this group is an important gathering, is that I think that recognition and acknowledgement is the really missing link in this discussion, and that some people do know the history well, but I think it's important that we think about how we could act on it and ensure that future generations don't forget the sacrifices that were made and the real benefit, in a sense, to Australia from the support that the Timorese gave to Australia. I'm going to just share a few slides that I've managed to gather in some of my research. Can you all see that picture? Overlooking Dili?
No. Oh, yes.
Yep. Okay. So that's a photograph from a really important village called Darlau, which is just a few kilometres to the southeast of Dili. And as a result of the Australians being able to man an observation post at this village throughout 1942, and despite continued harassment and raids by the Japanese, this was a vital source of information to the Australian military. And we were sending back regular reports on Japanese movements from this village. Many of you might have heard of Captain Laidlaw, who was the commanding officer at this of B platoon at this particular location. So this was a really strategic point, and as a result of being based here, B platoon was able to send back this sort of information to Dili, really detailed maps showing the location of Japanese troops in Dili. And this information was sent back to the RAAF and the US Air Force as well, which was able to use this to bomb strategic parts of Dili and elsewhere. So it just shows you how significant it was. And the fact that despite the Japanese continuing to come up to this village, to press the locals, to find out information about the Australians, that no one gave them up. And as I said, this outpost, very, very close to Dili, was able to be maintained right until the very end, when Australian troops were withdrawn in December 1942 and January of 43. When I went to this village, I interviewed the man on the right, whose name is Burabere Tulis, and he was over 100 years of age when I met him. And in our discussions, he started talking in Tetum, obviously, and he mentioned Captain Hart. And Hart in Tetum, it means four. And I thought to myself, what's he going on talking about these four captains? But of course, he was talking about a captain from the 2nd, 4th Independent Company by the name of Captain Hart, who was also stationed in Darlau and took over from Captain Laidlaw. So it's incredible that those bonds that were formed and the memories that people had 60 or 70 years after the event. And it's incredible to see that that this is something I think the Timorese still know these stories, that stories like this are handed down. So I think it's important for us as Australians to ensure that we don't lose that history as well. One of the really strategically important things about this conflict was being able to mobilise right across the country and to continue to supply the forces in what it was essentially enemy territory. And the photograph on the left is taken from a supply drop on the south coast. And these are Timor ponies. And you can see that they're loaded up with supplies which have just been dropped. And it's an incredible thing that when a supply drop was coming, and you can see the photograph on the right, that's one of the corvettes. The Australians had to mobilise the Timorese supporters and mobilise these pony trains in order to move the supplies. And so it was an incredible thing. We all know the saying, loose lips sink ships. And in the case of Timor, the Timorese people were able to be told that they needed to get to this location to bring their ponies. And in most instances, the information didn't leak out. So I think that is just an extraordinary example of the support that Australians had on the ground in Timor and right across the country, from the north coast of Darlau, stretching across to the south coast, all the way to the Timor Sea. The consequences of this support, though, ended up being essentially a scorched earth policy, or what the Japanese termed full-scale subjugation. And in fact, they actually used some of the tactics which were later made infamous by the CIA in South Vietnam, in terms of knocking off, identifying who the key supporters were, eliminating them, but also destruction of crops, as Peter has mentioned, in order to drive the population away from the Australian troops. And this here, in quite stark terms, is what was left of Dili at the end of 1945, because it was very heavily bombed by the RAF and also the US Air Force, and partly because of that map I showed earlier from B platoon of where the strategic locations were in Dili. So the cost of all of this on the Timorese was just immense in terms of loss of life, in the order of 40 to 50,000 people, but the fact that the country's infrastructure as well was also greatly destroyed. And it's very significant, I think, that at the end of this war, that because Timor was an anomaly, it was neutral, it didn't qualify for any of the post-war reconstruction assistance that it really deserved to have. So I think this is partly where it comes back to this whole point of recognition. And in fact, the man on the left here is Celestino dos Anjos, with the man wearing the medal. And on his right is Arthur Stevenson, who was from Z Special Unit. And he learned sometime after the war that Celestino, despite his incredible bravery and support that he gave to Z Special, that he didn't receive any recognition. And so the medal that his widow there is holding just inscribed on the back for loyal service. And so this is just, I suppose, an example of the really very small and inadequate way that Australia has acknowledged this service. And I think, as I say, I think the challenge for us is to think about the sort of acknowledgement that is warranted, but also I think perhaps an apology for, as was said earlier, that we really did draw a neutral territory into a global conflict, leading to tremendous loss of life, and also for everything that happened in the 70 years subsequently in terms of the betrayal in 1975 and the oil wrangling and etc. So at that point, I will just leave it at that and hand over to the next speaker, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for that very engaging talk. Thanks so much. I'm very interested in those photographs. I must get back to you about that one, especially the bombing one. And so now we've heard from three people giving us part of the history, and it's been very rich so far. And I would like now to, as I said before, to welcome Gregório Rosa and Ana Maria Ferreira. Both of their talks are being electronically sent to you. So that'll be the next one on the screen to hear it sort of from the horse's mouth, as it were. Thanks, Claire.
Nara Gregório Francisco Sales da Rosa. Hauniama Nara Salustiano Enriqueta da Rosa. E tempo funo japonês, e 1944. Japonês estava em Timor. Então, japonês tira tropas Namkari e general japonês, né? Ela é fatbesi, super fatbesi. Ela besi kauniama. Então, a administrador sociedade, né? Café plantação né? Haruka katuas, prefeitor geral, katuas tem forram fornece hamba tropa japonês. Então, katuas for hamba tropa japonês, katuas forram outro Austrália, forram outro nessa tropas ne be que ia fatbesi nem forram, katuas forram, fornan, australiano, katuas super australiano, então secretário japonês tinha haruka bakar katuas, ia fatbesi katuas, ni meu tio Domingo Soares, João Tran, José Lustiano. Que se seria fatbesi, lori mais se seria Airin poster eletricidade niang ne sai do outro japonês kisho mai fatbesi kisho tali to herbera kisho arame. Lorira para bahalo husu sira diambe ne sira outro nega de sira lá tene e de selo a abone de ni enfermeiro e de selo de ni carpinteiro e de selo de hauieiro ao larreo la saída. Mandor ne makatene Salustiano makatene. Então já pres bako nyama para tente diambe. Aqui hatene be comandante ne ho be tropa serne ne be. Nyama be hatente de dia lá House of Forhang, House Timor para Forhang be nessa tropas australiana nessa japonês Austrália lá. Deve japonês bako ni de lá o Boston ema serne hatente de lá de for ema Timor be bombela de Forhang. Então lori foi catua Baku katuas kanek be saidane, lori katuas bakisi fila fale, ihadade loron tulu ba loron hat katuas kore. Kalam be dader sang tulu ba madrugada kore ti arame ni limang ne. Katuas at kore sirna intolu, ida seruk ne hakila, crispin hakila, bolu babe, nasa, bombela sirna dia ho, mano be fatbesi ni at kore ame per bolu ame halai. Então ema mai hokila, depois capitão no forte be decoração ho be declaração basira, capitão hatete kera. How to e Austrália, governo Austrália bela lua, povo Timor, porque funo ne Timor luta hoje Austrália para be. Japonês na belta mais é Austrália, Timor foi mas também funo torramanta.
Yes, well, I'm sure, like you, I'm sure, like me, you find that very, very affecting. And how many other Timorese people could tell stories like that have been told in their families? And I thank Gregório, Rosa, and his good wife sitting there, and I thank them very sincerely. So now we're going to hear from another recorded message of another family in Timor at the time, from Ana Maria Ferreira.
I remember my mother talking about Australian involvement in the World War II. According to my mother, the Australian force occupied in December, not remember the date. It was before the entry of the Japanese force. The Australian force said that they were in Timor to prevent the Japanese advance and attack Australia. The government of Portugal at the time didn't agree with the Australian invasion and, as a caution, asked the population to take refuge in the mountains. My mother, my grandmother, and my auntie were in Vikeke. From Vikeke, they went to Watulare, and after a long walk, they arrived in Betano. It was hard. Because of the rain, their clothes were wet, and at night, cold, and lots of mosquitoes. Sometimes, they don't have nothing to eat or drink for days. In Timor, the Australian troops dispersed. Some stay in Dili, and others spread throughout the mountains. Those in Fatubese advised my Auntie Dominguez and her group to leave Fatubese because it came to their attention that some Japanese who were around Fatubese are following them, and it may be danger for the family. My auntie took the Australian advice seriously and left Fatubese. They made the route on foot. Because of the wet season, the journey was hard. Another uncle, Rafael, and his wife, Amelia, and their 2 kids live in Lauteng. The Australian and members of the Portuguese government took them to Luro. My uncle and his family couldn't continue the journey because my Auntie Amelia worried about her mom and got sick. So they went to Rosu and stayed there. Refugees went to Betano. There are many people. They all look scary and sad because they don't even know where their family were. In Betano, an Australian warship brought them to Darwin. When they arrived in Darwin, according to my mother, there were large holes in the ground. She thought that's where the Japanese bombs had fallen. From Darwin, some of the refugees went to Armidale and some to northwest of Victoria. My grandmother, mother and auntie, and some other family went first to Gleninnes, Armidale, and then to Sydney, Surrey Hills. Later, they moved them to Bob's Farm. My mother loves Bob's Farm. She said that the lady that received them, I think she mentioned Mrs. Fisher, but I am not sure, was really nice, a very kind lady. Then you'll think about the family that stayed behind in Timor. My grandmother heard that her brother Raphael and his wife were beaten almost every day at the head with bamboo by the Japanese military. They argue that my uncle was on the Australian side. The Japanese weren't kind. They beat and they killed many Timorese, and so the Australian. But, as my mom said, it's a war. Some Australian troops are good, some not too good. At the end of the war, some Timorese refugees went to stay in Australia, but at the time, the white policy was in force. Only white skinny people could stay. Sadly, they all have to leave Australia. Portugal sent a boat, Luanda, to transport the Timorese refugee to Timor. It was 80 years ago.
Oh, well, friends, that was very affecting too. And I'm very grateful to Ana Maria Ferreira for putting that together for us and talking about her family. Well, now it's time for us to hear from Ed Willis, and Ed has pre-recorded his talk, and very grateful, Ed, for that and for all the work you're doing in the Second Commando Association. So we'll hear from Ed now. Thank you very much, Claire.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. My name is Ed Willis and I'm President of the Second Commando Association of Australia. Since 2008, I've devoted considerable time and effort to gathering information, researching and writing about the Australian involvement in Portuguese Timor during World War II, especially the guerrilla campaign conducted by the No. 2 and No. 4 Australian independent companies against the Japanese occupation forces. I developed an interest in this topic because my father served as a signaller with the No. 2 Australian independent company, better known as the Second, during the campaign. The Second veterans developed a strong and enduring interest in the well-being of the Timorese people as a result of the invaluable support they received from them during their campaign against the Japanese between February and December 1942. Colin Doig, section and later Second Platoon Commander and stalwart of the post-war Second Commando Association of Australia, told the story of how the veterans first became actively involved in repaying what they perceived as their debt of honour. Cole says, in 1966, when for some reason or other the Portuguese opened the door, one of the first to take advantage of the situation was John Burridge, a member of the Second Commando Association and who had served in Timor. His major purpose was to try and contact his criado and to view the situation as it was so in Timor. While he was there, he was contacted by the Bishop of Dili, Jamie Goulart, who wanted to know what Australia was going to do to recognise the 40,000 Timorese and Portuguese who perished as a result of the Japanese occupation. John Burridge brought his knowledge back to the committee of the association, and a memorial was suggested. This was very quickly got moving, and this memorial was built at Darwin overlooking Dili in the form of a resting place. The memorial was co-funded by the federal government of the day and donations by the second and 4th Commando associations and various other people. It was completed and opened on the 13th of April 1969, which was a rapid and fine performance. Moving on from Cole's remarks, it is good to see that the Darwin Museum and Cafe has just undergone a major redevelopment that will make it a more attractive destination when tourists travel to Timor hopefully becomes more practicable later this year. The Second Commando Association would still like to see the memorial with its dedicatory plaques and associated flagpoles restored to a prominent position on the site so that the venue can resume being used for commemorative events like Anzac Day and Remembrance Day, as was done in the past. With the passing of the veterans, the old association was wound up in 2014 and a new association established. The current committee is mostly made up of family members of the unit veterans who maintain a strong commitment to helping the people of Timor-Leste. I'll just quote now from a letter from Francisco Xavier do Amaral, who was the first president of Timor-Leste, who wrote to Jack Cleary, then president of the Second Commando Association, in 2008. President Amaral said in his letter, "Perhaps even the grandchildren or your sons and daughters one day will follow in your footsteps to Timor-Leste, to be walking the hills together, seeing those places where, as young commandos with your Timorese compañeros, you fought the enemy, will be a grand tribute to one of our wartime generations." As an example of this commitment, the association has been working on a project to survey and record information about sites connected with World War II in East Timor. The main objective of the project is to economically assist Timor-Leste by encouraging tourists with a connection to the second, 4th, or Z Special, intervet veterans, or those with a more general interest in World War II history and heritage to visit the country and thereby foster awareness and better commemorate the service of our soldiers and the invaluable support that they received from the Timorese people. The availability of such information will enable those wishing to visit these sites on an organised tour or who are travelling independently to readily locate them and be better able to appreciate their history and significance. It is intended to have all the relevant sites documented in a standard and succinct way. This will include each site's name, location, GPS coordinates, relevant history, with ready access to other information such as maps, photos, local contacts, etc. I've been documenting these sites and making the information publicly available through the Double Reds website, doublereds.org.au, and our Facebook page. Examples of sites documented and described so far include Ramin, Mubara, Bazatete, Atsabe, La Cluta, Bacau and Relaco. To fund this project in early 2020, I successfully applied in conjunction with the late Jim Truscott for an Australian Army History Unit research grant to prepare for publication World War II in East Timor, an Australian Army site and travel guide, and also possibly releasing an app for smartphones and tablets, including the same information. Second Commando Association Committee member Murray Thornton and I intend to travel to Timor-Leste for up to a month, probably in the second half of 2022, July or August, to complete more site survey work related to this project. In conclusion, I've just been contacted by David Hopgood, a member of the Defence Cooperation Program Timor-Leste, DCP-TL, at the Australian Embassy in Dili. David has requested permission to share some of the posts you put on the Second Commando website and Facebook page, and also very kindly says, we can also possibly help you gather information, take photos, etc., as we have a Veterans Engagement and History Committee here in Timor as our extra regimental appointment. This year we'll see many posts about what happened here in Timor 80 years ago. This assistance will be a tremendous help in completing the project and fulfilling its objective. Thank you for having me again as part of the webinar.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. That was terrific. And I do commend the website doublereds.org.au as a wealth of information for anybody who wants to look further. And on that note, could I remind people that on the advertising brochure, Timor was invaded, on the other side of it, there are 6 links. There are written links, and one of them is the Double Reds. The other one is Timor Awakening, which we'll hear about in a moment. And the other one is the wonderful display, the Western Australian display, the Debt of Honour display. The 3 logos at the top of just above those links are also themselves links. One of them is the Australians Against Political Prosecutions in Canberra. One of them is Timor Sea Justice Forum. And of course, the other one is the wonderful diplomacy training program who are hosting this website, this webinar this evening. So thanks again, Ed, and we'll keep in touch. So now we're going to hear from Michael Stone. As I said earlier, he's up in Timor at the moment, and he pre-recorded this really good, very interesting contribution, which complements what we've already heard. So it's over to Michael Stone now. Thanks very much, Claire.
Kalandia Kamanek Solok Ba Maluk Sirohotu. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. It's a pleasure to be joining you for this 80th anniversary of an incredible bond and friendship. I hope wherever you are listening or watching this evening that you're in great health and happiness and excited to return to Timor-Leste or visit for the first time. I'm very excited to be visiting in a few days with some Aussie veteran mates to commemorate the anniversary. Over the last 80 years, many Timorese and Australians have lost their lives, have suffered, sacrificed, and been willing to put their lives on the line for the security of others, for the welfare of others, for the protection of each other, and for freedom, for self-determination. My name is Michael Stone. I first deployed to Timor-Leste in 1999 when it was called East Timor as an infantry platoon commander. I deployed again in 2001 and again in 2004 as a military advisor and training team commander to Commandante Falorata, where I got to spend a year and a half working intimately with the Falantil guerrilla fighters and emerging Timorese Defence Force. In 2006, I worked as a negotiator, as a liaison, and a spokesman throughout the conflict that was happening at the time. And in 2007, I had the opportunity to return to Timor-Leste as an advisor to the President, Jose Ramos-Horta. In World War II, the Royal Australian Air Force dropped leaflets throughout Timor that said, "We will not forget you." It had photos of Australian soldiers with the Timorese people. It was designed to raise resistance against the Japanese. The idea of that being incredibly risky and futile, but with the impression that we would return and support them. It's worth mentioning that throughout this 80 years of history, there are plenty of things that we need to learn from and not hide in the corner or put under the carpet. There was a great level of disgust and sense of betrayal felt by the Australians who had to leave behind their criados and other Timorese that had supported them throughout World War II. They had used all their money, anything they could exchange with the local population to get food, to get ponies, to get support. And they ran out of that and started writing IOUs. And I know Ian Hampel took to his last breath a great sense of unease that he had attempted, after returning from the war, to get the Australian government to repay those IOUs, and met with laughter. Once again, they felt betrayed when the invasion was condoned. Another example is the Ballabo 5, Roger East and others who suffered prior to the invasion of Timor and during the invasion of Timor.
They were murdered.
They widely known that they were murdered, premeditated, and it was done with the knowledge of our highest level of diplomats and decision makers in government. Then successive governments denied the opportunity for first aid, medical support, relief, and any voice to hundreds of thousands of Timorese who were suffering and perishing in a grand conventional war. We didn't know about that when we deployed, and many soldiers we take to Timor are surprised to hear of any of this. And certainly what has come up with regards to the oil and gas negotiations that go back to the 60s or earlier, but certainly run through the period of the 70s, and the negotiations that happened from 2002 and 2004 are also issues that we're not proud of. Indeed, cause us a great deal of moral injury, on top of the grieving and moral injury from the inability for us to save the people that had already perished or were beyond saving through our peacekeeping operations. So it's important that we recognise that all of these events happened, and they're all part of the 80 years of our history. On my healing journey, I have learned a lot more about Timor, and as part of it, I've formed a veterans program called Timor Awakening, which started in 2016, taking veterans back to Timor-Leste. Not just veterans that served in Timor-Leste, we've had Australian veterans from World War II, from the Malayan conflict, from Vietnam, from Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Rwanda. We have embarked on a number of projects pretty much since we started Timor Awakening, including a scholarship scheme where we supported 50 vocational education scholarships in cooperation with ETDA in Dili, and at the invitation of one of the senior Faluntor fighters, Commandant Riak, who offered us 5 hectares of land to build something, a retreat. We asked what could we do first, and he said it would be wonderful if you could build an English language school to help our kids, give them pathways to the potential of getting out of poverty, to be liberated from poverty and give them opportunities for jobs in the future, both in the development opportunities that are going to happen in Timor-Leste, but also to work abroad. So over the last 3 years, we've built a big school. We've raised privately over $200,000, and in cooperation with the Timorese veterans, we have built a remarkable school right near Batano, where our 2nd, 4th Commandos landed in September 42. just between the towns of Pitano and Same, which was a stronghold of loyal support for our Australian commandos in World War II. We hope that that legacy is living out the debt of honour that we took on and are embodying from our forefathers. Last year, like many, we were mortified on the 4th of April, Easter morning, to wake up to the images of Timor flooding and experiencing the worst natural disaster in living history, knowing that the country had been shut down, most international organisations had left, there was no media presence, and understanding during a crisis how limited resources are. But this crisis uniquely would not be getting any level of international support that a normal natural crisis would be. So we mobilised fundraising support as soon as possible, and some of us went on a humanitarian mission to try to get that story to the world, to try to promote more support to people that were suffering, and to get medical resources that we found out were to be incredibly lacking in the country. And over the last 10 months or so, since April, we've also raised over 100,000 US dollars, so somewhere around 140,000 Australian dollars, once again privately. And that has been executed with incredible diligence and respect through the Timorese Veterans Council, who've done surveying across the country and identified people who had lost their habitats, people who were suffering, the elderly, people who were experiencing extreme malnutrition, the disabled and the sick, and providing them with care packages, which is happening until today. The operation is still ongoing. Just to give an example of how important this connection is to our community, the Australian veterans, but also the wider Australian community. Obrigado, thank you for your time. Hauni Esperanza, my hope is that all Australians can learn of this incredible history, this unique and key part of our national identity. I hope that all Australians can put on their bucket list to visit Timor-Leste at least once in their lives, and I hope that that can start with an annual pilgrimage for Anzac Day, and that Timor-Leste is one of the key locations that Australians love to go to celebrate Anzac Day and to learn about our history, the sacrifices, and get inspiration for the future. And finally, my last hope is that in words and in deeds, that we do indeed continue to love our neighbour and continue to thrive as a region and develop our relationship with the Timorese people. Thank you.
Well, thank
Well
you.
done.
Thank you very much, Michael. I hope you're able to latch in from the wilds of Timor this evening. But anyway, I know you'll get the link to this. As you were talking and showing those wonderful photographs, I was thinking of all those other groups and individuals across Australia, some of whom are watching tonight, others who aren't, but who have really put their shoulder to the wheel. I'm thinking of the friendship groups, so many other groups. It is ridiculous to try to name them. I would like to mention the Australia Timor-Leste Advancement Society, of which I am a committee member, founded by Gerald Connelly in honour of his father, Paddy Connelly. But there are so many others, so many other people, and we all salute each other because we really are remembering what we should never forget. So more power to us all, and let's keep on going. One final thought before we have Dr. Jose Ramos-Horta speaking to us. I was also thinking of how much better for Timor it would have been had they not had to spend the expertise, the time, the money, and their best minds fighting Australia over the resources of the Timor Sea. How much better it would have been for those little communities there to be able to use the huge amounts that Timor has had to expend on gaining what is their right. And of course, we all know, and that's one of the things that motivates us all, of course, the dishonesty, the mendacity that just goes against our grain. Well, now, friends, it's my great pleasure to have a recording here for you by Dr. Jose Ramos-Horta, and he will speak for himself, of course, and then after that we will have very little time, but we may have some time to speak. I've copied 2 questions that have come up, and I'm hoping that we will have time to address those. If we don't, we'll do it at some other stage, I promise you. So thank you very much, Claire. If you would put up Ramos-Horta's video.
Dear friends in Australia and elsewhere, wherever you may be, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is always a sense of privilege to talk about World War II. In spite of that, we always have to remember the tragedy of wars, of so many people killed, brutally killed in the midst of the war. But there are always beautiful stories in the midst of tragedy, stories of humanity, stories of solidarity. I just wish to share with you a small but profound story. Many, many years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I took our late loving mother, beloved mother, Donna Natalina, to Darwin to have a brunch, coffee at the Cafe Memorial, which was renovated, started, redesigned at the initiative of the great Kirsty Guzman. So we went there, and there is a photographic display of World War II, of the Australian commandos, the brave Australian commandos fighting lonely on the forests, mountains, caves of Timor-Leste against the far superior Japanese forces. There in Darwin, when my mother looked at the photos, she immediately exclaimed, said loudly, excited, "That's Captain Ledlow. That's Captain Ledlow." She remembered Captain Ledlow, who was known among Timorese as Capitan Carabao. Our mother, a sister of hers, their mother, and later those who would become our father and grandfather, were up there in Remeshiu area with an Australian unit, and I presume led by Captain Ledlow. And at that point, at one point, facing a stronger Japanese battalion coming up the hills, Captain Ledlow told the people there, gathered there, we must leave, we cannot hold against the Japanese. Our, who later became our grandmother, native of Remeshiu, didn't want to leave with the rest of the family, but told the 2 girls, our mother Natalina and a sister of her, Noemia, to follow the Australians. So they followed the Australians for weeks on end until rescue in Betano to Australia. So that's how our mother survived. Our mother and a sister Noemia, but the rest of the family perished in Remeshiu, killed by the Japanese forces. There are many other stories like that that make us remember the bonds that created between Australians and the Timorese. Timor-Leste or Portuguese Timor at the time would have been, yes, a jumping platform to strengthen Japanese encirclement of Australia. But the Japanese intervention in Timor-Leste, from our understanding, was never really a priority. Priority was Papua New Guinea. So the war in Timor-Leste was brought in by the Japanese and Australians for no real strategic reason, as we can see in retrospect. At the same time, 40 to 70,000 Timorese lost their lives. I do not wish to talk about a debt. Australia, if there is any debt at all, Australia has long repaid it. First, through the solidarity, friendship of so many Australians over decades. And through the government leadership, John Howard and other leadership, and the People Australia leadership to make possible Interfed, an Australian leading Interfed coming to Timor-Leste. So this is our relationship, and I pay tribute to all who perished during World War II, and to those who surviving, related to those who lost their lives like us. We can only honor their memory in a loving memory of those brave sons and daughters of all of us, of Australians and Timorese. And my last words go to two Australian current heroes, Witness Kay and Bernard Cleary. It is very sad that the Australian government persists in persecuting, haunting these two brave Australians. They represent the very best of Australia. They represent the very best of the Australian spirit. They are like Captain Ledlow and others who fought bravely in the mountains of Timor-Leste. They fought in a different trench in homeland in Australia against the perceived abuse of power by Australian political leaders to gain advantage over a very small, fragile, extremely poor country, which you supposedly helped to liberate. So please let them go. They have committed no crime. They have shown, in fact, the best of Australia. They have redeemed Australian society and Australia as a country. My greatest respect and sympathy for Witness Kay, his family, and Bernard Cleary and his family. Thank you.
Well, we thank you, Dr. Jose Ramos-Horta, for that, that wonderful story, particularly about your mother, Donna Latalina, who many of us knew when she was living here in Liverpool, New South Wales. And your mention of Jeff Laidlaw, people would probably know, but there was a photograph in Michael Stone's presentation of two Australian men and two Timorese men standing on a sort of a hill. And it was Tom Nisbet and Rufino Alves Correa. Then there was Evaristo, and then the next man with the beard was Jeff Laidlaw, and he was called the Bull. That book was out, All the Bull's Men, about our wonderful men. Now, look, friends, time is moving on, and we've had a wonderful presentation. So grateful to everybody who had anything to do with this. I know David Dixon is going to close it properly in a moment, but I do want to give my own thanks so much to you. There were two large questions and I have copied them down. We have not got time to deal with them, but I know who they're directed to, and I'll send out an email with the comments to you by email, because they're important questions. So thank you for those. So I'd like to hand over back now to David Dixon and the wonderful diplomacy training program, Patrick Earl and Claire, and to give the final remarks. Thank you very much. Don't know whether you're there, David. Not sure what we do here. David Dixon, are you there? Calling David Dixon.
Thank you very much, Susan. You've done an excellent job.
Oh, you're nice, Ed. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
I'll be in touch.
Yes, okay, for sure. I'm just waiting. Have we got David Dixon to close? Just one little hitch perhaps has happened, but it's gone pretty smoothly, and so grateful to the University of New South Wales for doing this. Claire, are you there?
Look, thank you very much, Susan. I can jump in maybe on behalf of the Diplomacy Training Programme.
Thank you very much.
To say thank you very much for a really wonderful and inspiring evening from all of the speakers. It's been very moving, and it reinforces the importance of the links, of the people-to-people links, that people on this evening's webinar have done so much to build. And quite often the difficulties between governments are there, but the people-to-people links that were established 80 years ago just are so resilient and so important and are so meaningful to the futures of both of our countries and societies. The Diplomacy Training Programme, we try when we can before COVID to take human rights defenders to Timor every year to learn and be inspired by the extraordinary victory against all odds of the Timorese in winning their right to self-determination, to winning their independence and their place in the world. And it really is constantly an inspiring place to go and visit. So we can only echo what we've heard this evening is let's build those friendships, let's build those links, let's find ways to support the courageous people of Timor-Leste as they work for human rights and their right to development. And Susan, you're just extraordinary, and hats off to you, and thank you so much. And if we can support you in your work, we are very honoured to do so. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for this evening.
Thank you very much.
If I can just jump in, Susan. Sorry, I got called away by an escaping puppy. I'm back. I only missed the last second or two of the webinar. I'd just like to give my personal thanks to everybody who's been involved, but I can't do any better than Patrick has done. But the one thing I do want to add is to give our thanks to Patrick and to Claire for all the work that they've done in making tonight possible, and to you, of course. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks very much, University of New South Wales. Thank you, David. So we'll see each other again, no doubt, perhaps in Timor.